we've talked about cognitions and we've explored some of the other components related to problem solving and language and all of the aspects that actually help us understand maybe how we define intelligence. Intelligence is an interesting word. Many of us think we understand that. We may throw it around as this is a person who's very intelligent, but what do we really mean by that term intelligence? Early on, some of the key names that are associated with a definition for intelligence are Charles Spearman and Raymond Cattell. Both of them gave us this greater focus so that we could start working on understanding what is this idea of intelligence. Spearman identified that there was this general or this G factor that was associated with intelligence. It was this commonality that was going to be prominent amongst all of the abilities related to intelligence, and he called it the G factor. Raymond Cattell actually divided the concept of intelligence into two components. He gave us the idea of crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence, whereas crystallized intelligence is that idea of those things that we just know. That tends to be the facts, the things that are just a known component. But fluid intelligence is that idea of how to be adaptive, how to take information and apply it in a new setting, how to bring in new information and figure out how to maybe challenge preconceived concepts. That is what fluid intelligence is known as. Another name associated with intelligence is Robert Sternberg. He produced a model of intelligence known as the triarchical theory of intelligence. That is not an easy thing to say. You should try that 3 times fast. Triarchical, triarchical, triarchical. I think I did it, by the way. So there are 3 ideas to this: analytic intelligence, practical intelligence, and creative intelligence. So let's go to the practical, because it's practical. Practical intelligence is going to be the street smarts, the common sense that help us operate in our day, in our ability to navigate the information. Analytic is going to be more that academic side of things, how we learn these ideas and grow in our understanding that helps us be successful in more of a thought side of things. Creative intelligence is going to be that imagination, that innovation. That's how we do our problem solving. And he saw that we are actually embodied with all 3 aspects of those. And some might have a stronger of that practical intelligence, whereas another might have a stronger analytical intelligence. So he saw there were 3 components in a triarchical theory of intelligence. Seriously, you should practice that. I'm going to. The last key name you want associated with intelligence is Howard Gardner. And what he brought is this idea that there are actually multiple intelligences, that there is not just this kind of academic kind of intelligence, but there's intelligence in lots of areas like linguistics or mathematics, in music, in bodily kinesthetics like dancing or other physical athletic kind of prowess, in spatial understanding, in interpersonal skills, in intrapersonal insight into who we are, and in the naturalist sense. He gave us this idea of 8 different intelligences, definitely outside of that typical triarchical box. One of the things that developed out of what Gardner shared is this idea of emotional intelligence. So that interpersonal intelligence and intrapersonal intelligence is now core to our understanding of emotional intelligence. You might have seen IQ, and we see that as the acronym associated with intelligence, really usually associated with academic intelligence. EQ is associated with this relational component in terms of understanding ourselves, understanding another person, and knowing how to relate effectively. It also has to do with the idea of understanding how to identify and navigate the emotions we might have in a situation and recognize with empathy the emotions that another might have. That's emotional intelligence. Other aspects that show up under intelligence are going to be that aspect of creativity. Creativity is this ability to generate and get outside of the traditional ways that we think of things. If you're someone that loves a blank piece of white paper because now you can make anything with this tool and maybe some sorts of coloring options, or even using the piece of paper to make a sculpture. There are lots of ways that you could think about that white piece of paper. I, however, am not someone who's creative with a white blank piece of paper. If you put a shape on it, I can make things out of a shape, but I am not creative like that. So when we think about creativity, it can show up actually in lots of ways, not just in that artistic sense of that. Artistic pieces actually can be outside of that norm too. When we think of creativity and artistic expressions, we're actually looking at ways that people can be divergent in their thinking and also convergent in their thinking. So divergent thinking is where we get outside of that box, where we take what is and go beyond to see what could be. Convergent thinking is where we take all sorts of information and figure out how to fit it into the box so that we can work within an established, expected plan for whatever the goals might be. So now we've got some different definitions of intelligence, and the question is, how do we measure intelligence? Well, we do have some intelligent quotients, or ways that we've come up to measure intelligence. One of the things to understand is that most intelligence tests that you would typically see are actually going to assess for academic kinds of intelligence, so that analytical kind of component. There are going to be aspects that are related to memory and recall, to spatial awareness and problem solving, to the ability to navigate numbers and the ability to navigate sequential components. All of those are considered the components that are a part of success in academic settings. So when we think about an IQ test, the key names that you should associate with that are Stanford-Binet and Wechsler scales. So Binet and the Stanford team put together the very first IQ test. Alfred Binet worked with that team, and they built what then became standardized and is still used sometimes today. It's a pretty extensive test, has multiple subscales that are used to assess strengths and weaknesses in an individual's ability to perform in that more analytic setting. Later on, David Wechsler came along, and he took what was established by the Stanford Binet and built some other structures and substructures within his assessment that helped us get at a different aspect of intelligence, but with some overlap there. Wechsler's definition of intelligence is this global capacity of a person to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with their environment. What we know about individuals with strong IQs that are going to come up on the Wechsler scales is we're going to find individuals that navigate academic settings and maybe some performance settings that require language skills, problem-solving skills, analytical thinking in those settings. Both the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler scales have had a number of revisions. Wechsler has come up with a scale for adults and a scale for children. And one of the things that's been noticed in all of those IQ tests is something that we call a Flynn effect, that over the years, schools and communities are seeing higher and higher general levels of IQ scoring on those tests. So are we getting smarter? Is that what's happening? Or is there something else at play? What we recognize is this idea that, first of all, the Wechsler scale was based when we had a certain kind of information, a certain amount of information. And now in schools, we're covering more of the information that is sought for in those IQ tests. So students are being trained to think along those lines. Basically, we're being raised, or we're raising the next generations to do better on assessment tools like these IQ tests. Does that mean they're smarter? In this case, what it means is that they perform better on these tests. That's not the same thing as having a higher IQ. When we think of intelligence, when we think of smart, we actually have to come back to what are we assessing. In these IQ tests, what we recognize is they tell us some things. The subscales tell us more specific things. It could be how fast we problem solve, how quickly we can pull from memories. There could be a lot of aspects in that. They are used in a lot of ways, and understanding how they can be used appropriately or validly is very important. This goes back to that whole how we set up research. Is it really testing for intelligence? Is it reliably testing? Every time are we getting similar kinds of recording of IQ scores? Both Stanford Binet and Wechsler have been found to be reliable. But valid is still a question because we don't have a consistent definition of what intelligence is. What we have is a definition of what those tools test for. One thing that has been established in testing with these tests is this idea of a bell-shaped curve. When there is a representative sample, a sample that represents the general population, and we give these tests, what we find is this general shape of a curve in the data that show us that we have the majority of individuals scoring in this middle grouping, that most people are going to be pretty clear to that average point, which has been designated as 100 on both the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler scales. So an IQ of 100 or anywhere from 90 to 110, that's going to be the group that's about 60 to 66% of all individuals. Now, this has been normed on samples that are English speaking or Western educated. So you have to also account for those components on where did they find the results for these tests. In this case, these were established in the United States with English speakers to begin with. And that presents a problem because so much of what's being tested is based on U.S. culture and the components tied to that. So if you have someone who's an immigrant or English is a second language, they may not perform in the same way or strength on this test, which has nothing to do with whether they have a strong intelligence or not. It has to do with whether this is the appropriate assessment tool for intelligence for individuals from those cultural backgrounds. And that's a key thing when we think about assessment tools, especially when we come to intelligence, because these tools have been misused in the past to deem certain individuals from certain cultures as not having enough intelligence, whereas what they really were was culturally biased. And we have had a lot of prejudice as a result of that. Now we know we have to develop culturally sensitive assessment tools in order to understand, again, whatever we're defining as intelligence. So let's assume that intelligence is this thing that we have a group of people that are scoring in that average group. What created that? Is it nature or is it nurture? And what we know now is that it's probably that interaction between those, that there's a component that's part of the nature, a genetic predisposition, but it's also the environment that's going to support that expression of intelligence that had the potential. Remember epigenetics. So you may have two twins from the same parents who both scored between 90 and 110 on the IQ test. The likelihood is that those children have now been given the genetic predisposition to score somewhere between 90 and 110. However, if one twin is given a very enriched upbringing opportunity with all sorts of experiences with problem solving and creativity, maybe taught to read and explore the world in a very rich sense, whereas the other one was placed in a situation where schooling wasn't an opportunity, where limited resources to creativity or play or exploration are offered. The question is, do they still have the same intelligence? Again, it depends on what the test is testing for. In this case, it could be that the person that had the enriched environment is going to score higher on an IQ test, and the person with the less rich environment is going to have a lower score on the IQ test. Do they have the same potential? They have the same potential if they're identical twins. However, everything in their environment has the potential to support or potentially hinder the expression of that genetic predisposition towards what we now call intelligence. The last thing we want to understand is that there are definitely disabilities that are going to impair our ability to learn. And the things that might show up related to that would be dysgraphia and dyslexia. Those two are probably the most common that we see in terms of the academic setting. Dyslexia is actually a problem with the way the brain processes the visual sensation. So when someone with dyslexia is looking at a word, the letters can be mixed up or eliminated, and so there's a whole mishmash that they're looking at. If you are somebody without dyslexia, you can see that word for what it is, whereas someone else may see it and it doesn't come out making any sense at all. So what might look like scoop, SKOOP, to you because you see those letters, another person might see that and it could be all mixed up and say scopus, which you may not know at all what a scopus is and why is it associated with ice cream. Seriously, this is not making sense, which is the problem for individuals who have dyslexia and are trying to read. Dysgraphia is a different kind of disability that's, again, associated with how the brain is processing information. And for those that might struggle with this, they can read just fine, but they have a hard time getting their fingers or hands to shape the words when they're writing. Now, certainly keyboards and computers have helped with some of that, but the idea of being able to control and communicate in that way has been a problem for those individuals with dysgraphia. There are other kinds of disorders like this related to the processing of numbers, related to how we speak, and those components. And these are all things that psychologists are definitely interested in figuring out how we can support to compensate for those disabilities and help these individuals succeed as much as possible in their academic settings. Intelligence, language, cognition, that's what we've been covering and what we understand maybe a little bit more in terms of there's no clear definition of intelligence, but we can thank our parents for some of it.